Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, it's taking me a little bit longer to get some of this stuff done. I'm in crunch mode in my personal life on a project. And so, in keeping with, hopefully, some high-quality subject matters, I have some really cool ones lined up, but I got to do a bunch of research for them. And it just has to be meticulously researched. Otherwise, if I miss a single fact about some of these subjects coming up, you guys will catch it. One of you will catch it, and you'll turn it off. And I don't blame you. So I'm making sure that that's not the case. But you know, I'm always looking for the wild angle on something because we're talking about deep thoughts here, not just thoughts. We want to go deeper than most shows do because that's what we do. Isn't it amazing how you can have a show with 6 guests and it's the most shallow, trite crap you've ever seen on the internet? It's like there's tons of those shows, and we're going to keep it subdermal to your consciousness, right? So today's show is about, I don't know if I'm going to call it this, but my current thought about this theme of this episode is called counter science. What does that mean? Well, you know, science is science, no matter if you like it or not. It's like the truth. The truth is the truth, whether you can handle it or not, right? Well, science is actually the same exact thing. True, real science. History is history, whether you like it or not. But in order to satiate the tender butts of people, we have allowed the establishment to start lying about these things in some categories, right? History they've always lied about because they're trying to protect your psychology for being attached to a society that's potentially a genocidal, murderous society. In America, they lied about how the Native Americans were wholesale slaughtered across this country, telling us it was blankets with flu on it. I mean, what a joke, right? Meanwhile, you hear of these catastrophic massacres, like the Shoshone Indians that were massacred by the Mormons after a little false flag they did on a railroad track. Almost 500 people got slaughtered that day. They weren't supposed to be north in the winter because they're more transient, nomadic Native Americans that go south in the winter, north in the summer. They got trapped in the north during the winter and slaughtered. So there's a lot of these things that you sense. You hear things, whether you're watching some trophy channel like History's Mysteries or something like that. You're watching this stuff and you can feel it inside you. This is BS. You can just feel it. But you may or may not have the time or the inclination to know exactly how to prove that that is BS, but it still is. So what I've done is I've gathered 20 interesting inventions, discoveries, things about the world where we're told one story, which may or may not be true. But what I want to turn your mind onto is some alternate takes on why someone might have lied about some of this stuff to control your ability to think outside the box. Before we dive in, I just want to cover history is obviously revised to make sure that you don't feel like a monster. Science is revised because they don't want you to discover freedom. Zero-point energy systems, all kinds of wild stuff. Remember, the military told the patent office in America, don't give any citizen a patent for flight because we don't want to pay anyone a royalty because we expect to build lots of flying vehicles as soon as we figure out how to do it. But 1907, one of the Wright brothers went to Paris for a show for the World's Fair and flew. And so France was like, we'll patent this thing right now. And then America would have to pay France, right? So they used the, 9-hour time difference, and they went ahead and flushed that patent through that evening and gave it to the Wright brothers. Conspiracy right in your face, man. Now, truth in all other forms is obviously only shrouded on purpose because people are trying to control you. You know, imagine, just take UFOs for a split second. What if the person assigned to the UFO exploration within the United States government, who's a yes man anyway, not intellectually deep, not philosophically deep, not religiously extended or enlightened, and they're terrified of what they're seeing because they're a troglodyte. They just crawled out of a cave, right? And so they're terrified of what they're seeing, and they impose that on you. They are projecting their fears on you, and they keep you from any of that information. There's a lot of that. And of course, when big corporations get involved, there's no limit. Now, this first one's a little tough to say, but you guys know what it is. It's Antikythera mechanism. Some of you may know how to say that a lot better than I do. But it's a ancient Greek analog computer used for supposedly astronomy and predictions, right? So this is a wild contraption found in 1901 or 1902. It's comprised of 82 parts. It looks like a little mechanical box. Its dimensions are, actually, I'll give you the exact dimensions. It's 13.4 inches by 7 inches by 3.5 inches. And it is able to calculate things. Now, it's found in 1901 or 1902. But after analyzing many aspects of this, including the biological life that was stuck in it, the metallurgy, this thing easily dates back to 200 BC. So 200 years before the fabled existence of Christ. That's a long time ago, right? So what they've done is they've given it the definition of being able to calculate, stars, positioning of stars, equinoxes. They're imposing on the machine, obviously, what they think that the society at that time would be most concerned with. Not a bad, assumption. But that's given that we understand the history of that exact time frame. The more miraculous thing is they've only found one of these things as far as I know. It's like the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, found in the late 1700s by Napoleon's men, says on the stone that there should be one of these placed at every single marine merchant location all the way down the Nile, because it's Ptolemy IV taking over for Ptolemy III, his father, who was murdered. And in the Rosetta Stone, it says there will be retribution. Here's the new ways. And there'll be one of these at every... So we should have minimum a dozen Rosetta Stones, because the top got chipped off, which caused a little bit of, angst for translating hieroglyphs, right? So this machine would have been created by a single mastermind engineer. And you have to assume that there would be several evolutions of this machine up to that point. Now, what's interesting about this machine is that colleges have taken this machine and they have scanned it. They've x-rayed it to find out all of its pieces without actually disturbing the machine itself. And they have built several replicas of this device, and then they've applied to it all kinds of equations that could be derived from this. But just so that you understand, when it comes to calculations using devices, there's some implied features, and then there's some features that are very evident about this kind of equipment. When you're doing mathematical equations, there's integer math and there's floating point math. What's the difference? Well, integer math has no decimal place. The floating point has decimal places as much as you need it, right? So if you need to go 0.001, because that's how slow a star moves in the sky, then in computer software, you'll create a float variable and start doing calculations in float style. However, if a mathematician using a particular machine understands that, hey, I know there's a decimal place, but I'm going to use this box that does integer math, but I'm going to maintain where the decimal place is. I just need it to crunch the numbers for me. Then you have a much more brilliant box simply by insinuating that the user is capable of using it properly. Now, this box is very interesting because historians allowed it to go back as far as 200 BC. None of us will probably really know who analyzed the machine and gave it that designation. because it goes back so far, my layman's interpretation, because this data would be something you'd have to really dig into to find out. After discovering this thing in 1902, it's going to take several decades to claim that you've got carbon dating technology or some other historical means of comparing this to something else, right? But it got back 200 years before the time of Christ. That's fascinating, because I think if it had been discovered today and rolled out today, they would have put it well within the AD year index to make sure that we didn't believe too much about what existed in the previous recent past of man. There is going to be a barrier here in some of these inventions and some of these things where they don't want you to think that a man has been wise for a really long time, because that immediately opens up Pandora's box for, well, if we've been around this long, then why are we so under the thumb of tyrannical governments, tyrannical leadership? Why haven't we advanced if we've been around for so long? And I'll give you just a stupid analogy, but you'll get it. What if you took your average African, just a normal civilized area of Africa, and you grabbed them and you took them to Panther City? They'd never seen it before because it was stealth, right? And there's no one actually living in there, but some researchers find it, some other African folks find it, and they go, come here, look at this. And they hit the button, down comes the stealth shield, and they see this beautiful city made of all this technology. There's flying ships just sitting there waiting to be jumped into. Computers that are beyond your imagination. The town talks to you because it's all AI. And then the people, the indigenous people of Africa, go in there. You know, Africa's got a huge spread of capabilities. You've got tribes that hunt in the morning, and they wear very little clothing because they're always in a real, warm climate. And then you got the normal folks that go to work with the tie and a suit. Imagine them all going in there, and they look at this, and it says, your ancestors built this. Whoa. Now their self-image is going to completely change, won't it? When a little kid looks at it, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm 8. Well, I need to jump on the bandwagon of wherever this tech was severed from us, such that we don't know that we made this. And I'm going to go and I'm going to make the next generation of this town. I'm going to spend my whole life figuring out what makes this town tick, what materials they used, whatever, right? It totally beefs up a nation. Well, that's replace Panther City with history, real history, and replace just the isolated example I gave you of Africa with the entire world. And now we built some amazing stuff, but there's a lot of old farts that don't want you to know that, because it will stifle you from creating a goal to ever do it again. The next one is the Baghdad battery. So in 1936, someone discovered a ceramic vase with a copper tube with an iron rod. So people thought, wow, this with a certain chemical reaction inside of it, you can do even, I think, organic lemon juice and that kind of stuff, insulated properly, will start releasing electrons from these surfaces. And the ceramic is obviously a non-conductive container for this, whereas the two iron and copper inside, again, juiced up with the right emission type organic substance, it's been done in so many television shows, it's funny, can start emitting a reaction. And so this invention from 36 was well within the realm where, the Smithsonian hadn't quite, Smithsonian is a little under maybe 100 years old at that point, completely created to grab technology, send it to Europe, and tell people it never existed. When they found all the giant skeletons in the United States, they grabbed them, documented them, sent them to Europe, and said they lost the bones. When they found 50,000 pygmy bodies of fully grown people buried in these wild graves in Kentucky and Tennessee, again, scooped them all up, moved them to Europe, and said they didn't exist. It's just crazy what they do. When they found the Egyptian caves in the Grand Canyon, they went in there, and look up my episode on G.E. Kincaid. They went in there and researched it, allowed documents to be written about the research, then said everybody was crazy and the guys that found it didn't exist. We got pictures of them, right? But this Baghdad battery, it's very interesting, right? Now, what needs to be said is, without a device to harvest the electricity, what would be the point of creating electricity? Well, as we know, with the building of things like the pyramids, which we think uses a completely different technique, there are plenty of uses to create a piece of metal that will resonate light off of it when it's basically getting thermally heated with the passage of electrons on a valence, right? A lot of you know that there's those little light bulbs that look like candles. You usually get them during Halloween, and they're shaped. It's a piece of metal filament cut out like a flame. And the way it works is it kind of capacitates and throws fire around it, and it looks beautiful, right? First time I ever saw those was in the mid-'80s at a haunted house I was helping to build. So exactly how these batteries might be used, the theories were actually pretty strong in the 30s, 40s. As they were looking at this, they're thinking, well, they knew they had found things like these quartz beds in what is falsely classified as a temple in Egypt, which is more of a hospital. And people would lie down on these big, beautiful quartz beds. And then they found the mechanical apparatus underneath the bed where there was a circuit that one could use a staff to complete electrical transfer to the bed, which would then resonate the body and do the same kind of technique that pops all the cancers in your body, pops a lot of bacteria in your body. Very sound technique. Look up Royal Raymond Rife episode. You'll see movies of this happening with his device, right? They tell you that Royal Raymond Rife didn't do what he did, but he videotaped it because he used microscopes that he had built that had massive power, basically not quite as powerful as an electron microscope, but electron microscopes can only look at dead material. It can't look at living, moving frames. And this dude videotaped that. I put all that in my episode. So have a look at that too. And if you know anything about electronics, you might be saying, well, I mean, you won't say this, but the layman might say, well, how much voltage could come out of one of these things? How much amperage could come out of one of these things? And the idea is, well, if you mix a bunch of these batteries together, you could start getting a pretty good charge out of these things. So it may take more than one. But they don't want you ever talking about energy or the theory of energy. You start touching methods of creating power outside of the bill that you get in the mail, and they'll start shutting down that industry really, really fast. And that's what's taken place. So what they've done is they allowed the first team to go. And they kind of like that, right? Tell all the truth first, right? This is how a lot of history mystery channels go, a lot of ufology stuff. Because they know you're only going to remember the last thing said. They understand that. So all the positivity goes first, then they body slam you at the end if you believe what they say, because they're an authoritative source, right? A television channel trying to make money off advertising, which is essentially the game of luring you with news at 11. The whole world's going to blow up, but you can avoid it. News at 11, but the crash is going to happen at 10 o'clock, That's how the news works. That's how channels work. They don't give a crap if you ever learn anything. They just want to charge money for your eyeballs, right? Go see my episode on the movie Looker, and you'll understand it way deeper than you did before. Because it's such a basic invention, we can only infer what that could be used for. But the components inside this have been studied by several electricians and electrical engineers that I know, and they're like, yeah, it absolutely works. You have to add a chemical in there that's going to create the flow, the chemical flow, and then you're going to start disturbing an electron valence on this thing, and you're going to get what you're looking for. Basically, in my opinion, a lemon juice, for instance, might emit the dielectric force, which will hit the magnetic force, spin the magnetic orbit, and give you electromagnetism. It's very simple when you go down to an ether model of the universe. The next one is, I hope I'm saying this right, in English it'd be Vimana. Could be Vimana, but it's the Hindu scriptures that talk about this almost like a Devo hat. So it's a pyramid made out of circles, and it's a step pyramid, and it is these mythical flying vehicles of which the most enlightened and most, gifted individuals, plus some of the gods, would fly to travel the land at the time and visit man. And there's been all kinds of stuff online about actually finding vehicles and digging them out of the ground that are these vehicles, obviously not working anymore. But of course, it is pushed out as a mythical invention. There's no real, there's a few cutout diagrams, which I think were made more recently, of course, suggesting how these things might fly, right? What's interesting about it is that they're pretty uniform about its shape, being a kind of a step pyramid made of circles. If you're trying to picture it in your brain, just think of a cake made in a circle, but the next cake on top is slightly smaller, so it creates a step, and you just keep going until you get like a little capstone, again, like the Devo hats, right? The band Devo. Now, what's interesting about this to me, because I'm always kind of leaning on the side of, well, maybe these things did exist, right? The real gotcha with that one is that it would obviously be a very powerful vehicle to have in existence, right? Now, there's two trends of thought, if they did exist, as to why they don't exist today, okay? The first and easy one is they never existed. It's just a mythical thing, and so they obviously can't exist today because it's not based on any algorithm of reality. The second one kind of relates to an old Twilight Zone where they had a town called Peaceful Valley. And Peaceful Valley was a town where some traveler, about 104 years before the episode starts, I think it's the 103, 104, came into the town and brought them a machine that allowed them to do anything they wanted to, but he gave it to the elders of the town and said, you're not to share this with the rest of the world until they're ready, because they will take it and it'll convert E equals MC squared into an atom bomb. So you can't give them this because they'll destroy the whole planet with it. And the episode starts when a news reporter, following some directions from a friend, screws it up and drives straight into the town and finds out that some weird stuff starts happening. I'll leave it at that. Imagine that something like this ever existed. This would be an amazing level of advancement for prehistoric man, or for sort of the I'd say, well, even just around the time of the pyramids, which on this show, we think the pyramids started, around 40,000 to 35,000 BC, based on a bunch of very specific things. We're going to get to those in this episode. Now, there was never any rumors with this vehicle that I know of that talked about fire coming out of the bottom. Because obviously, if you have fire coming out of the bottom, anyone near the vehicle, when it moves into the people's area, would be fried, right? So these things were magical. They're almost just as good as a UFO. And so we would have to assume that someone figured out some algorithms of electricity on a massive scale and was able to create a shape that must be congruent with the math that they used to create the vehicle. But if it did exist, and there's no secret operation where they found them and then they stuffed them away in some warehouse, if that didn't happen, then we have to assume that either they flew away back to some god dimension or some other planet or some other dimension of existence, or they simply put them away, maybe destroyed them because they're going to be too powerful for the people that would inherit them. And of course, one can assume if a vehicle like this existed, that it would take a tremendous effort to operate the vehicle in general, right? Just who knows, right? Maybe it was a little Atari 2600 joystick, and maybe it was like some crazy Willy Wonka contraption inside. So it's probably best you don't let the average person who doesn't understand anything that's going on in that vehicle get a grip on it. Now, the next one is called the Piri Reis map. And it's a map that is hardly the best map out there that claims this. There's one that was transcribed in the 1300s that goes back, 3 centuries before the Piri Reis map. It doesn't really matter. We have maps, ancient maps of the world, before they figured out, I believe, longitude properly, that document the Antarctica. Again, one of them goes back to, I think, 1329, I believe is one. And the 1329 map, which name escapes me, was actually said in the fine print on the map that it had been transcribed from a previous map. So the one that was painted really nice was going back even further. Now, the claim, of course, is that the mountainscapes and the terrain of the Antarctic represented on this map matches what NASA scientists have done through LiDAR scanning or some sort of radar scanning of the surface of what's there underneath the snow. Now, even though there's a lot of snow in the Antarctica, you need to know there's a giant difference between the North Pole and Antarctica. One, polar bears are at the top and penguins are down at the bottom. So having a picture of the two of them together on some climate thing is hilarious. But Antarctica does have surface, and it has big giant mountains that go up, right? And that's why it's typically 60 degrees colder in the coldest time of the year than the North Pole, which is all made of ice. The North Pole almost completely melts down and refreezes every 3 years. So there's times when they can just drive boats right through that, and they don't have to have a ice crusher to do it. South Pole, not so much, right? You have this gigantic wall of ice. And believe me, I know the community that's going, hey, man, keep going. For now, the mountainscapes that we can see in photographs, even just right off the coast, match what's on these maps. So it begs the question, you can't make one of these maps very accurately if there's a bunch of ice there, which suggests there was a time when there wasn't ice on the Antarctica. And that think about trying to map a giant piece of land. I mean, it's a big piece of land, no matter what model of the world. In fact, if it's the alternate version of the world, it's much bigger, right? But to get up on land and figure out where you are and draw it and trying to figure out relation between, one ridge and another, one mountain and another, as this land continues to keep going up and up and up, right? It's a daunting task. The other big question is, you got to get in a ship that has enough food to get down there and then get on that land and survive. Because the theory is that it wasn't cold at the time that these maps were made. That somehow the poles shifted and pushed the cold down there. And therefore now it's completely uninhabitable without massive technology to live there. But even as an explorer that goes down there, it's like saying, well, pick a time before Christopher Columbus and tell me, how would you completely map North America with any previous group of people coming over, the Vikings or Pilgrims or what have you? How long would it take? And then how could the map be more ancient than when we had people to cross the United States? It took a long time for European men who started on the East Coast to get to the West Coast. It did. Because there's already people here and they don't really want you here, and you don't speak their language, and you're only thinking about how savage they are and you're going to kill them and all this other junk. So perhaps the Antarctic wasn't as inhabited, by any living humans, and so it's more free. Perhaps it didn't have any predators that could take out the folks that were there, but that would be one of the first pieces of land that didn't have that, huh? It is interesting. I've had a very good friend of mine. She's one of my researchers for screenwriting. She spent 2 weeks in Antarctica when it was bright outside. And she said, man, it's wild to be there because you have to sleep on these black tents. It's tremendously cold. And the trip there is formidable. The trip back is not so much fun. But she was glad she went. They did all these ice, columns digging out the history of our atmosphere or what have you. Now, a ton of you have been doing research on maps in general. I will warn you that artificial intelligence is getting really skilled at creating anything. And if you told, I practiced on this probably a year ago when the Dolly engine came out through ChatGPT, creating fake maps of the world, creating islands that don't exist in addition to the ones that do exist. And a year ago, it was nearly indistinguishable with real maps. If one is talented and takes it inside a Photoshop product or photo with Infinity software, you could put the names on there, pick wild fonts, draw it by hand on a piece of paper, scan that, put that in, color it down to sepia tone, blend it in with what's there. And it will look legit to 99% of the people looking at it through Telegram or social media. Just remember, researchers, or I should say explorers, used to often launder money from their investors by telling them that they had discovered a piece of land and they named it after the person who paid for the trip, and that they register it with some international agency that will always recognize that as their name. They came back and said, hey, here's more money. Go find one for my mother, my sister, my kid. And they would go out, and sometimes they'd find real ones, but a lot of times they would make them up. And so they would draw them on a map. You know, imagine a guy in Paris, and he's never going to get on a boat because, you know, it's just not a fun experience. The guys go over to Americas, and they're in some, you know, bay, and they say they find something. They come back and name it. The guy's never going to be able to verify it. By the time he could possibly verify that he had been had, the explorer's way gone, probably living across the ocean. The guy's not going to chase him. So if you find maps that say, you know, and there's Mandela effects, oh gosh, this thing disappeared. No, a lot of that was just a scam. The next one is interesting. This is called the stone spheres of Costa Rica. Now, I've talked about 10 years ago on this show, these spheres that seem to be falling out of the sky. And these were some sort of fibrous thing when they would cut them open. They looked like some sort of carbon fiber, I should say, stripping that was spun around a sphere and then had it was sprayed with something that made it almost look like steel. It might have been even steel on the outside, some sort of thing they could mold on the outside with a hook on the top. And there was all kinds of theories about these things being the stars hanging off the firmament, and they look burned. You know, it looked like they went through the atmosphere really fast, some part of some spacecraft. But what was interesting about it is no one ever got killed by these things falling out of the sky, which reduces the liability of anyone having to pay damages, right? At least significant damages. But they went to all the space agencies in the world, NASA, European Space Agency, China, Japan, and Russia, and said, are these yours? Are you using these as some sort of like fuel tank? And when you opened it up, you noticed very quickly the only thing that would probably ever be allowed in here wouldn't be anything that man would consume, like water, but probably a fuel. Except there was no valve system on the outside of this thing that really looked like you would get fuel out of it, right? It was no in and out. So keep that in mind, and then look up these stone spheres from Costa Rica. It appears, at a minimum, that man had figured out how to lathe a perfect sphere, which may or may not sound impressive to some of you, but when you don't have computers and, you know, big machinery from a metal shop, and these are stone, man, right? These things are pretty impressive. They kind of look like if you've ever, I don't know where you're listening to me, if you have Targets, the supermarket, or not supermarket, but the big, you know, Walmart type stores. But as one of their fashionable items in front of their store, and as a barrier for cars entering accidentally into the store when grandpa hits the accelerator instead of the brake, they have these real giant red spheres out front made of concrete. But these things are pretty big. They kind of range in size. And yeah, there are a few of them that look like they've been around a little longer and they've lost a lot of their perfect sphereness. But most of them are pretty spherical, right? The location where these things are located is Palmar Sur. That's what you say, S-U-R. There's 300 of them, okay? And they're like 6.5 feet in diameter and at the largest size. The way that they have been discovered, the archaeologists of the time, and think about these things are spheres, so if you want to rearrange history, it wouldn't actually be too difficult because they roll, right? But there's a home apparently on this hill, and these spheres lead up to the house. So it was, they believe that these were constructed, and they say it's like 800 CE. Can't remember exactly what CE means, but they're old, right? And that they go up to this chieftain's house as sort of a celebratory thing that basically says, these are you're getting into royalty, right? So it's like a presence attack device, right? Same thing that Europe has with, and Egypt had, and Greece had, which is you create gigantic temples because you're trying to do a presence attack on the people. This is the place where the people in charge live. This is what they do. See, this is as big as the gods, right? And so when you're walking into some of the temples and plazas and other structures in Egypt, where it all started, right? Imagine looking up at a 40 to 80 foot pillar that is just massively round with all this ornate, language on it. It's all gorgeous and beautiful, which obviously it was lost by the time the Greeks stole all of the methods of Egypt and claimed it as their own and said they invented everything. That's pretty funny. And then it went to Rome and it stayed pretty much the same. But the columns of Greece and Rome are just a fraction of a percent of the mind-blowing nature of what was created several thousand years before. Because how? Maybe the technique was lost, right? So these spheres are utterly fascinating because of their precision. Look them up online. Actually, don't worry about it. Just watch the episode on the video, because I'm going to cut all these pictures in here. But they're amazing. They are really, really, utterly precise. And, most of us know if you took a nail and a string and you put the nail in a dirt, into the ground, and you could draw a pretty good circle, on the ground. But now think about constructing that in a three-dimensional way, such that any of the tool marks and methodologies that you use to make these stones utterly vanishes. That's the amazingness of this whole thing. Plus, the stone is actually, I think, a level 9 rock. And so you're talking about a really tough substance to start mulling around, right? Now, I hope I'm saying this right. The Nazca lines in Peru. I think everyone's seen this stuff. The Peruvian deserts have these images drawn on the desert floor. And when you're a little kid, you're like, oh, that's cool. I've done that, But you did it maybe at like a 10-foot scale. This stuff is at mile scale. And, you'll see some that are very organic, and you're thinking, well, if they made a mistake, you wouldn't really notice, as long as they consistently finished, the illustration. And then you start seeing the ones that have really super precise straight lines, amazing curves, and you're thinking about who could make these lines. And if you're not familiar how the lines work, they actually dig a little bit of a trench and they bring rocks that are bright. And so they dig these trenches out, removing all of the debris. That alone will make the illustration. But in a lot of cases, they brought brighter rocks and put them in place so you could really see it. I think maybe some have darker rocks as well. Just whatever it is, it must contrast within these lines that they kind of scooped out. I don't think it goes down that far, but it's just to basically group them together and to not drift away when it monsoons in those areas, right? So these are fascinating. One, it's fascinating that they could create consistent lines for a tremendous distance, right? But the second one was, obviously, how the hell do you know what you're drawing on the ground after a long distance to make sure you bring it back? There's a little bit of mathematics with some of this stuff. A big part of the technology would be to say, one, making a straight line for a long time, I think is a lot more difficult than people think. Well, just keep walking in a straight line. Well, you know how that works. You're pretty good, but if anyone makes a slight mistake, there's a bend in the line. Or it wobbles a little bit, right? And plus, maybe the terrain isn't as friendly in every single region you're making the line, so you have to really work hard in some areas and not so hard in the others. But if you have a line that loops, because a lot of these drawings are looped lines, as long as you don't take the loop line too far away from your origin line, it might be a little bit easier if you're going to make a squiggle next to a straight line, because you could kind of measure distance. As an artist, when you draw someone's face or something on a piece of paper from scratch, you're looking at the photograph, and in your mind, you're remembering that's a 1/4 inch away, so do a 1/4 inch away. That's an 1/8 inch. You're just seeing the distance in your head, and you're replicating it, right? That's why illustration is so good for your brain. It builds up all kinds of mechanisms in your mind that will help you in life everywhere, right? And you always get better at it. So if you think you may have lost your ability. You've actually gotten better not drawing. And when you go back, you're even more impressive than you were before. But this begs another technology, doesn't it? The other technology, which everyone assumes, is that they had a way of creating hot air balloons. Why do we say like hot air balloons? Well, hot air balloons, which I swear to God, they want you to believe that a blimp didn't exist until the late 1890s. And then it's just a rumor until about 1910. It's an absurd assertion on history. And I'll tell you why. How many huts and places where people live, even a wigwam, a teepee, right? If you enclose a fire, man is going to very quickly realize when you make a fire and you put your hand over it, hot air goes up. They're figuring that out millennia, like hundreds and thousands of millennia ago. Man went, whoa, that's really hot on top. Well, you just advance a few centuries and people are going to realize this is a cause and effect model, that heat goes up. If you build a wigwam or some sort of Irish hatched roof back from 2500 BC, and if you ever had an outlet to make sure your roof didn't catch on fire, and someone tried to cover it up with a blanket of some sort of woven cloth, it's going to push it up. And then immediately the mind goes, whoa, what the hell was that? They put it over again. Whoa, look at it, goes up. Without knowing the word force, without knowing exactly how to apply that, they're going to start seeing a mechanism. Every time man saw a cause and effect model in the physics of the universe, man grabbed a hold of that, right? You look at the treadmills that they used to build where they had a grain crusher building and they put the treadmill in the water. And I probably got the wrong word for that, but the little wheel that caught the water as it went by the house and it ground through a gear mechanism, grain or whatever inside the building. Someone saw that, wow, water has a force. And they probably saw a village member get into a current and drown and went, oh my God, that's so powerful. A person got sucked underneath and couldn't get themselves free. Then they start harvesting that technology to do things. We're talking about thousands and thousands of years, people. We're not talking about an overnight invention. But now imagine one of the reasons, perhaps, why there's these weird sort of, it can range from almost Egyptian to sort of Anglo-Saxon type geometry on the face, being in all these statues in South America when that genetic didn't exist down there natively, right? Could be that they were flying there in these vehicles that as technology advanced, they were no longer necessary. Who knows? And of course, it is obviously understandably theorized that your Peruvian Indians or perhaps an Inca nation or pre-Inca civilization or Mayan civilization, before they were called these things, could have participated in actually creating these themselves. And it could have been the visitors that created them, or it could have been an homage or a signal to the people that fly over. We know you're there. Come visit us every time you come by. Because every time you do, you bring cures, you bring food, you bring knowledge, and we just want you to make sure you land. But a lot of you have seen some of the cave and rock carvings in these regions that have a lot of like gray alien looking people. Very alien looking beings. When they absolutely have the ability to render a man, they have the ability to render all of the livestock in that area perfectly. I mean, a little distorted, but it's not going to look indistinguishable between mankind. So they have these other beings in their drawings. A lot of them are a lot taller than the human beings. The human beings are portrayed as these little characters. So it could be that if you have, this is almost romantic, but the Close Encounters movie where these craft were flying past villages in India and they just kept it primitive and beautiful. It was like, well, you're just there. I'm not going to question. I'm not going to watch History's Mysteries of the Sci-Fi Channel to see if what I saw with my own eyes was real. I'm just going to let it be real. And they heard the tone in their ears as in the fictional movie. So the extreme theory is that they could have been visitors. The other theory is it could have been visitors from different continents. And the probably less extreme was that somehow some elder figured out this technology of drawings in the desert with these rocks accurately. Someone had to pin something on paper, right, to make sure that you'd have to have something, I think, in parchment that's mobile to teach the people what we're building, right? Maybe you drew it into your own hand, but what would you do it with? A ballpoint pen? It doesn't exist yet, right? It's impossible to believe that one person would make the whole thing happen. It could be that a lead a designer would throw down rocks and there's a team behind them finding the rocks and keeping it straight. But you still have to train everybody to do that. Because with all these accomplishments in man, everything I've mentioned so far, nothing is created without a purpose. You have to have a serendipitous chain of technology that is either discovered or gifted to the people that are using it. And there has to be a purpose. What would be the purpose for drawing giant pictures in the desert? And why hasn't this been done around the world? Yes, there's a lot of European little tiny etchings compared to the size of the ones in Peru. Your European ones with the unicorns and the Alfa Romeo logo was actually etched in the ground near one of their palaces over there. Those are just pencil sketches, little tiny, tiny sketches in the margins of a real piece of art that's in Peru. We have to assume the message is up. You're drawing on the canvas of the earth to communicate a message up. Who is supposed to get that message? God. Could be just as simple as them believing in God or a God and them paying homage. But then the pictures are really interesting. Monkeys and insects and people. So it's definitely worth researching if you haven't. The next one's a controversial one. Before I go into this next one, try not to get upset if this one is a prized possession of your belief system. Again, we can't police thoughts because then there's no progress in the world. And this is the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is held in the Vatican, and it has gone through several iterations of analysis and acknowledgement, and then non-acknowledgement, and then re-acknowledgement. It is the most fascinating piece of, I believe, propaganda that the religious community of the Catholic Church has ever claimed to have possessed, right? This has nothing to do with negating the existence of Christ or God or anything like that. The intention of this device is to create more belief, to create something that's undeniable, right? Now, I've never been tremendously fascinated with this, but I have to say I've been in the right place at the right time to watch the biggest production of research into the Turin probably since the 90s. This is supposedly the piece of cloth that was draped over Christ after he was taken down from the cross. And his blood is supposedly in this cloth as the trace of his entire body. Now, about 20 years ago, a bunch of stuff happened to this thing that got the Catholic Church to completely back off its authenticity. But in the last 5 years, they're ignoring that, just like a nice pharmaceutical product like aspartame, where the clinical studies killed all the rats, killed all the monkeys, and was deemed unhealthy for humans. And then when George Herbert Walker Bush, plus Donald Rumsfeld, who was the CEO of Searle Pharmaceutical that made this horrific stuff, when it crossed over into the Reagan administration, they erased everyone on the FDA, and all of a sudden this poison was good for your body. Well, this is what's happened to the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin they had a little piece of it taken out, and they did carbon dating on the cloth with the bias of trying to make it real. And it came up 15th century. It came up right around the time that Michelangelo was doing a lot of work for the church. Then, of course, they take a model of a human being, and they lay it down, and they put the cloth on it. And then they look at the shroud, and they're like, wow, it's super detailed at the top, and then it's like the illustration stops getting accurately portrayed. It's almost cartoonish towards the bottom. And, of course, anatomically, because of the lack of detail, and it looked like an abandoned project, they started to kind of create the magic bullet from the JFK assassination, right? The one bullet that's got the power to kill like 20 people, right? But bouncing all over the world, right? So then they started playing with the theory. They said, well, maybe Christ was in sort of some fetal position when this cloth was put on, but he's got to be laying on his back for this whole thing to work, right? And so his knees were up, and why would you do that? No one puts anybody on a gurney all in a fetal position straight up. That takes a lot more energy. So they deprecated it. Then there was an interesting version of this documentary that tried to convincingly prove that Michelangelo, who was never really that religious, belonged to a sect that was actually against the church and believed that Christ never existed. And so because of that, they always defamed any image of Christ. And because Michael's lending his brush to their efforts, their code to each other, the secret thing they would do to signify allegiance to each other, was to portray Christ with a severed neck. There's no blood. It's just you don't do the art in a straight line across the neck, essentially telling each other that they don't believe this whole thing whatsoever. And again, the closer you get back to the time of Christ and when the church was doing the Inquisition to drive this into the brain of man, because a lot of people were alive back when they said he existed. They're like, we don't know anything about this guy. What are you talking about, right? I think it would have gotten around had the Son of God showed up, right? So that's the genealogy of that sect, right? They didn't believe it was real. Now, given like his close proximity to the top brass of the Vatican at the time, you'd think someone would have told him, right? But it is fascinating who believes in it and who doesn't. I have friends that I think if you interview them on a separate interview, say a podcast, and you ask them, are you religious? They'd say no. They say, do you believe in God? They'd say, I don't know. Do you think Jesus was real? And they'd say, no. Let 2 weeks pass and put them in another podcast, and you'd say, do you think the Shroud of Turin was real? Yes. You're like, what? How do you put those two together? I have a friend who's 78 years old who just told me at dinner that in first part of the conversation that he wasn't religious, and the second, he's defending the Shroud of Turin. You're like, wow, you got to go do some research on this thing. People who were trying to prove this thing was real had to basically admit, it's a very modern thing compared to what you're trying to assess here. The Dead Sea Scrolls is not on my list, but when you read that the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in 1947 and that the Anunnaki Scrolls are discovered in the same exact year in Egypt, you see the propaganda mechanisms trigger each other. The Christians, the Catholic Church, gets these Dead Sea Scrolls into the vernacular of everything, and it's really not the Bible. It's really about darkness and lightness, a people of darkness, a people of lightness. It's not like the scriptures in there, right? And then the Arabs are going, oh my God, these Christians are now beefing up this portfolio of proof, and so we're going to jump out our folks, the Anunnaki, who basically were our creators, right? I've got an episode on that too, and you'll find out how frustrated I was when I found the utter absurdity of the Anunnaki scroll. I mean, it's just badly written. Francis Bacon did a much better job on the King James Bible. I think the conclusive statement I have for you about the Shroud of Turin and Christ, your belief in Christ, is if you were to meet Christ after you die and you walk up to him and you say, God, Jesus, I was really questioning my belief in you until I saw this piece of cloth at the Vatican. Well, put it this way, you will work very hard to be more embarrassed the second after you say such a thing to Christ. Because I'm sure that in some rhetorical way, he'll tell you, well, you shouldn't have needed that in the first place. So don't worry about things like that and your faith or your utter belief, right? Let yourself have what you believe. Don't worry about props, Don't worry about it. Just use your logic of your spirit. You'll be okay. Okay, this next one's very tough to say. I think I'm gonna try to say it. Sacsayhuaman stones. which are gigantic stone walls in Peru. We're back to Peru. Again, if you watch the video, you're going to see these pictures pop up. Now, when you read about this stuff, I believe personally, you don't have to believe this, that there's a game being played with the history on this one. They always try to say that these amazing inventions, these amazing construction sites were built very recently. Look, Wikipedia places these in the 600 AD. And that means, oh, isn't it cute those stupid South American people finally learned how to build a wall? That's why it says 600 BC. Okay, you can't carbon date rock. Really sorry. You just can't. Okay, they'll tell you that they can, but it's an absurd chain of logic for how they talk about getting the oxidization and patina off a rock to try to figure out how old it is. It's to surrender your brain to them because they lie about a theory and a technique to carbon date a rock. But these rocks are extremely, extremely angular, very unique. I don't think a single rock is remotely the same shape. And yet these things not only interlock perfectly. I mean, you can't slide a piece of paper between them, right? But they're also embossed, which means instead of, imagine bricks without mortar, and they like a normal brick wall, but these things actually swell up like pillows, every single brick. Well, all of these things swell up like pillows, but they are perfectly honed. The amount of embossment is exactly the same distance. I mean, I haven't been there personally to measure this, but man, when you look at the photographs, it's utterly phenomenal. Now, there's a whole bunch of theories on rocks, these particular rocks and rocks like these. One of the romantic theories is that they were poured into place. Now, what happens when rocks are found in the world in these wild configurations? The pre-Inca, Machu Picchu's and other things like that. Baalbek, Libya, that's got 1,000-ton base rocks that build up these temples with 40-foot red jade pillars that come from Egypt, right? Well, Egypt's got 1,000-ton black boxes before they're carved from Lebanon, right? For Baalbek, Lebanon. They go and they study the rock and they go, what kind of rock is this? And geologists know what kind of rock it is because they've seen it in other locations. They've even got color books. Can you imagine that? Books that have color photographs in them. And they have microscopic, analysis where they can go up to the rock and they go, no, that rock's, 1,000 miles away. Okay. So the idea that these rocks are somehow melted down and poured into place is actually probably more amazing than carving them and putting them into place the way that they've got them, right? Because with infinite labor, you can create a bunch of stuff. Infinite amount of time and history and that kind of thing. If you were to melt down a rock, do you think it's going to pour it in place and reconstitute like normal rock? Of course not. Of course not. Why do you think lava looks different than all the other rocks? It's been recently boiled and reconstituted and dried out with tons of air pockets in it. That's why it looks different. Do you think it's down inside the mantle of the earth like that? No, it's totally crushed and it's much more solid down there. When it pops out, it aerates just like a styrofoam and dries, and that's why people put them in their driveways, right? The unbelievable consistency of South America and the carving of rocks is really in itself a categorical phenomenon of these individuals that someone, in a particular region of the world had figured this stuff out. But now if you go back to my episode on giants and pygmies, there might be something that makes a lot more sense, okay? Magellan said that when he hit South America, he saw a giant on the coast. All of his men are in the boat. This is in his log. This guy is gigantic. He's like 9 feet tall or something. They took a boat over to him, picked him up, brought him over to their ship, and they had a dinner together. This is fully documented in his logs. And the guy said, "Are you from up there?" And they didn't speak, he didn't speak a language that was obviously compatible with theirs. But they said this guy was utterly massive and he had a voice that was very deep. Now, fast forward 30 years from Magellan's time frame, and I forgot the other guy's name. It's in my episode. He goes back, and he goes onto the continent, and he has a whole different experience. He finds a society of gigantic human beings. Again, a lot of the settlers that came over from Europe said they found giants here in North America, especially a black-haired race and a red-haired race. And one of the old women that was born in the 1790s, she wrote before she died, she said, when I was here as a child, these two races were in sort of the Minnesota, Wisconsin area. And they said, we witnessed the darker-haired race kill the redhead race, and then they just kept navigating north until they vanished. And no one knows, they didn't follow them, right? So South America, this guy comes back and has paintings commissioned based on what they saw. And they said that the average child was as big or bigger than the tallest man on his ship, averaging about 6 feet. Now, what child means, we're not exactly sure, but he said that these people were, 9 to 12 feet tall, depending on their age. Okay. Well, what happens when a man or woman starts sprouting up massively tall in this day and age? There's Chinese, there's Americans, there's Europeans, there's Arabs. Whatever race you got, there's a giant race out there, right? With the South Sudan's got some of the tallest people in the world. Well, what if you had very proportional race that was actually designed to be large, as opposed to our folks that immediately start having joint pains and all kinds? They're leaning on people when they get on, podcasts or whatever. What if you were supposed to be that size? Well, now your muscle and your bone structure is it's not a thyroid problem. It's not some other issue or defect in your body. You're supposed to be this big, like all those skeletons that they found. Again, watch my episode, Giants and Pygmies. We go through all the news clippings that were printed back in the day. And these weren't found by farmers. These were found by doctors and scientists of the independent communities who were looking at these things. Like I guarantee you, if I found one, a big giant skeleton, I could tell you whether it looked proportional or stretched, right? But now, how difficult would it be to build some of these giant walls if your average population height was about 10 feet to 12 feet grown? Now, what happens in this world? Well, we don't hire little people to do big people things, right? And I don't mean, little people. But we don't hire a 5-foot woman to do gigantic work that a big giant man will do from one of these, strongest man in the universe contests where they grab those big stones and put them up on things, right? Get our biggest folks to do that. Well, imagine you have a race that doesn't have any problem finding the bigger folks. So they find these rocks. 1,000 miles? Well, one, they're going to cover a lot more territory than we will. And in terms of moving some of these stones, well, if they're bigger, what's the problem? No one ever considers that the pyramids could have been built by bigger people as well. Maybe their skeletons, for whatever reason, were never found because they were used in different ways, or the environment ate them up, the bones. Whereas in America's, in South America, lush jungles to hang on to a lot of this matter, right? So I personally do not believe these things were melted down and put in place. Where would all that technology be? Because you're talking about a completely different technological platform that has to exist. And to only use that technology to create a wall, but not everything else, begs a logic problem, right? Wouldn't homes be built out of this as well? Wouldn't there be just palaces and castles built out of this technology instead of just a wall? If prehistoric man had figured out the Saturn V platform, and let's say it really could do what they say it could do, well, geez, we'd be all over the universe, wouldn't we? But they didn't, so we didn't, and therefore logic prevails, right? Now, this next one, it's a little tough to say. It's Voynich, Voynich manuscript. It's named after a gentleman that published it in the early 1900s. But it's a manuscript. This is wild. I have actually seen this before and forgot it totally existed. They think it was created somewhere between the 1400 and like 1440 through some carbon dating of the paper. And it is a wild, sort of hippie-looking book, okay, with beautiful illustrations, especially for the time. Very, very impressionistic, beautiful stuff. But it has this writing in it. It's 240 pages long. Some of the pages are missing. But it has a left to right script that's written in some sort of cursive. And no one has been able to decipher it ever. And of course, it begs the basic questions of whether or not this was supposed to be, obviously during the Renaissance era. It begs whether or not this is some sort of a language that was simply lost and no other surviving written word of this has ever been found anywhere else in the world, or whether or not the individual who wrote it had figured out ciphers and said, wow, I'm going to write something really beautiful about the pictures in the book, but in a cipher that you have to have an intellectual capacity to decipher the cipher in order to appreciate the art, which I think would be very romantic and beautiful. And then, of course, it could be a hoax. What really blows my mind right now is that this is now 2024, right? And we have supercomputers of all kinds. Right now you can, I think, download the entire text off a website. We have supercomputers that do cipher cracking. That's what they do. And with quantum computing, I know it sounds like just a word to say these days. It's an abused phrase. With quantum computing, honestly, it should be able to take this document in and slam dunk it very, very quickly, especially if you had 50 qubits remotely stabilized, right? Let's say we had a 97% stable qubit machine at 50 qubits. Even the 3% error should start popping out words because you just simply keep running it until it finds something that makes sense. Now, to say that you've studied ciphers and that kind of thing, it's an interesting claim. But since ciphers are so nebulous and evolving, you could be pretty skilled at one type of cipher deciphering, and then somebody just mixes up the Yahtzee dice one more time and you know nothing about what this next generation of ciphers can do. And I'll just give you a really quick one. When you look into the Zodiac Killer's ciphers, 3 pages of which have never been translated, you have ciphers that are simply A equals this weird character, B equals that weird character. Those ciphers get cracked almost instantaneously. It's just not even an issue. So to have 3 of the Zodiac ciphers undecipherable at this stage in life means he went an extra step. Now let me give you just a real quick way that you might be able to look into this and come up with some results. Again, supercomputers do exactly what I'm saying in a split second. So what I'm saying is just really low-level stuff, but a lot of people don't think about this. We have 26 characters in the English alphabet. Now, this is not obviously most likely written in English, so it's written in Italy. It was created in Italy, they believe. So you would be talking about Italian or any language in that region, which could really be Spanish, French, and any type of Mediterranean language, could be even Arabic translated. However, if someone's familiar with writing Arabic script, they probably go from right to left and have a lot of, just inbred technologies for writing letters that would look more like Arabic, right? So it's probably not Arabic. But now, if you have 26 letters in the alphabet and you want to create a really great cipher, you would probably create, let's multiply it up times 4. So you'd have 104 characters, 4 stacks of characters that could be an A, 4 characters that could be a B. So you mix all these characters together, substituting one of the 4 letters for one of the letters that's in the language that you have to know, right? You and I, knowing perhaps English, because you're listening to me in English, we may not, if you don't speak Italian, or even a special dialect of Italian, which might have some more ancient spellings. I mean, again, I don't think any American could go back and read English from 1400 and understand a word of it. I mean, you've saw a couple words. So you'd have to know the ancient dialect of those times. and then metabolize up what could possibly be. So that might be how the person's hiding that. It is hard to believe that someone would go to all of that effort to not eventually be discovered in terms of what the cipher is. The other one that you have to keep in mind is the fact that someone who's that clever typically leaves a clue. The clue could be in the illustration side of the game. Now, not knowing Italian and not looking at any one of these pages in my lifetime, besides what I just looked at online, is there a single word that's just written properly? It doesn't sound like there is. But again, if you're clever, you'll write some sort of, key somewhere inside the pages. So if you're really into ciphers and torturing yourself, this is a lifelong project for you, okay? The next one is the Ark of the Covenant. Now, most of us who were born perhaps in, Now, for those of us born in the 20th century, we probably saw a movie called Indiana Jones, where you have probably one of the most gorgeous representations of the Ark of the Covenant and what its function is and what its origins are than a lot of other movies. Now, it's in a lot of old movies, even back to the 30s. But the Ark of the Covenant is very similar to, say, the Sword Excalibur or the Grail, the Holy Grail. In the movie, Indiana Jones, it was supposed to have the Ten Commandment tablets in it, which I think is beautiful. And, at the end of the movie, they open it up and the tablets have turned to dust. And of course, when the Nazis were starting to put their hands through it, they're like, oh my gosh, well, this was all a hoax. And then all of a sudden the power comes out and they stole the, that Mexican director's vision for Dune, illustrated by Moebius. The Ark of the Covenant is obviously something sacred like Noah's Ark. The amount of times that Noah's Ark has been discovered and then no one ever says anything after they print something in a magazine, they look at the footprint of this boat up in the mountains, and then nothing happens. I mean, it's just like NASA saying they're going back to the moon. We're going back. Well, no, we're not. We're going back. Well, weren't we supposed to be back already? Shh, A lot of that game plays around these artifacts, right? The Ark of the Covenant would be nothing shy of a box created by God, to be honest, and it's Old Testament level stuff. Now, a lot of you will mention, well, have you considered the idea that in the vaults of the Vatican that some of these artifacts exist? Well, if you thought that it existed, and say you're a pharaoh, let's just say, or you're even the Catholic Church at some later point in time, and you want the thing to exist, you could create it. It won't be the magical thing, but it could be up there, and you could just simply say, don't touch it. Anyone who touches it immediately dies, right? Wasn't that part of the movie? Or it's actually in the Bible, right? When they were transporting it, someone, it almost fell off of a cart of some sort, and a guy puts his hand up, and he immediately dies, right? I don't personally think it exists, because I don't know that God would leave behind such a powerful talisman of any kind, because obviously it would get in the wrong hands. And then if it was truly powerful and in the wrong hands, then that person would be able to destroy the world. And then if it was in some, religious Templar's hands, like the end of Indiana Jones 3, where the old Templar was in there perceivably for 2,000 years guarding the Grail, he would keep the world from being negative because he'd have the power to do so, which you would think would be God's will. So I chalked the Ark of the Covenant up right next to Excalibur's sword. Okay. The next one is the Longyou caves in China, which are pretty wild looking when you look at it. It's only getting publicity, like in terms of videos, in the more recent times. This was actually written in poetry of some Chinese scholars a long time ago. And so but it was, it was like, it's fairly figurative, saying that there were caves with, pottery and things that seem very similar to the Longyou caves. I'm not sure if this is the exact location where they recently ran a bunch of videos with some really primitive looking sculptures in a cave and said this is like the Chinese ancestry. I think I have more faith in the Chinese ancestry than perhaps they do. But I need you to understand that, let's just say your culture, for whatever reason, is joining the rest of society. And you're doing a miraculous job doing so. You're going from horse and buggy in, say, 1910, and now you're building some of the biggest architectural things, maybe not so great, but you're at least doing it, and you're advancing faster than any society has perceivably advanced in human history, from zero to hero, right? The thing you're missing, if that is truly the case, is your history. And because China has been such a warring society among itself for, thousands of years, they end up destroying, just like the Romans going down and defacing, pharaohs on reliefs, right? And pharaohs supposedly doing it to their own people. I actually don't buy that. I think it's all the Romans, the Roman Catholic Church, saying go down there and scrape that stuff off, because it talks about the virgin birth of Horus and Isis together, and we can't have virgin birth being known before our virgin birth. Again, Ireland's got Cuchulainn, and there's a bunch of them, right? It's an old story. So I wouldn't put it past China for the benefit of China to synthesize some of this stuff and say, well, see, that's our past right there. But I think they went way too primitive with this stuff. I don't think there's ever been ancient ruins or ancient objects found that look like boxy pinatas, the sculptures they found in the cave that I saw. I don't know if it's Longyou. Now, I just looked up some photographs of Longyou, and it's very Turkish caves, which we're going to get to in a second here. So it's very smooth, very interesting. I have complete faith that all man that realized they could chip away at a mountainside and say, you know what, if I get a little hole going in here, because there's a natural one over there, or there's a natural one, and they work on it, like, hey, man, we're out of the elements. We can block this off so the animals, the predators can't get us. I believe that's possible. Nothing miraculous about the architecture there. But if you need to rebirth your history, look at Stonehenge, right? Stonehenge was discovered in one location. They say they didn't move it, but if you look at the old pictures of it and the old drawings of it, there's a lot of stuff they must have moved out of the way. But when it was reconstructed in 1954, which nobody denies now, because they denied it at first, and then okay, you got us. We totally put this thing together. And then this weird Druid sect showed up, who at the time, I guess, was not very, very acknowledged in the British people. It was like, okay, the weirdos are here doing their thing. You don't need to get too butthurt about it or think that, crazy sacrifices are happening there. They may indeed do those things, but yeah, it was completely rebuilt. And then, of course, they start implying on Stonehenge what it was, and they obviously try to predate it before the pyramids to say that white man got that one started before those Egyptians. Like, well, look at the thing. It's not exactly a technologically advanced rock, because going back 5,000 years, you're just right at the mastabas with official Egyptian history, and you're really getting into the giant pyramids right away. So the Egyptians still slayed whoever was in these regions in terms of architecture and being able to build things, right? But I'm going to reserve my total belief until I see more about the Longyou caves in terms of it really being indigenous to those folks. There's a big controversy with the Wall of China, in that because I've had some friends go there in the last 2 years, and they said, man, when you get on this thing, you realize it's not to keep people out of China, it's to keep people from China entering the other side. If you really pay attention to how it's actually architected, it's the opposite. So they end up believing after they visit, this wasn't built by China, this was built by whoever was trying to keep these folks out. Who knows, right? The next one are the statues of Easter Island. Eastern Island is way out there in the Pacific, and it is, I think it's like nearly 4,500 miles from the nearest coast. We've talked about these a lot in various episodes. The amazing things about these statues, because there are obviously a lot of them buried into the ground, which now we've dug them out, and we realize that they actually built the whole body all the way down. It does look like a sort of a 9-pin system from bowling that's just been carved down. So it's very interesting. But there's been a lot of research, because apparently this was found by the Dutch in like the 1730s or something. And I think when the Dutch found it, there were actually people on the island, if I remember right. There's only 2 places where they actually face in towards the island. But the ones that are on the coast actually have a mixed genetic, because you can see a Polynesian nose a mile away, and most of them are all Polynesian-looking folks. But this starts to morph as time goes on, and it could be that the folks that were putting this together had some rocks and merely changed them. Like we think the head of the Sphinx has been changed a couple times, potentially to favor the latest pharaoh that went into power. But the big thing about these rocks is, where the hell did the stones come from? I've heard estimates as far as 12,000 miles away, meaning we think in our brains, someone put this on a boat? These gigantic stones, what kind of ship is that? And then they traverse the entire Pacific Ocean? And how the hell do they navigate to this island in the middle of nowhere? Someone, a geologist, had figured out through diving off the coast of Easter Island, oh, look on the bottom of the ocean right here. There are quarries on the bottom of the ocean, potentially 350 feet deep, that look like that stone. And it really looks like there's slots on the bottom of the ocean where they may have dug up these stones that they put up on the island. Now, to understand what might have occurred, you should go watch my episode called The Expanding Earth Event. And this is a theory that was submitted online. You cannot find this video anymore. I have tried to find this video. This guy did a huge presentation. It's either an hour and a half or even more. He's a former NASA scientist that basically was thinking out of the box and 90-degree angle thoughts, which really translates to against what normal science would say. And he studied the plates of Earth, the shifting of the plates, and realized that the Earth is truly expanding and there's no Pangea drift stuff. But you've heard me say this a few times if you're an OG listener. He conclusively proved to himself that by the Indonesian islands, the Indian Ocean was a mile higher, potentially, than the Pacific, and significantly higher than the Atlantic, and that one day this broke, which is where you get the giant sludge mark on the bottom of the ocean, where you have the deepest part of the ocean in the entire world is right there. And here comes this gigantic wave, which then hits the western coast of North America, creating a lot of the embedded seashells that go all the way to Kansas, where I grew up as a kid, in the center of America. We're talking 1,500 miles inland. Really bizarre. So imagine that the ocean was much further down when they were building Easter Island. Much easier to traverse because, people like Kamehameha's tribe finding Hawaii and the Hawaiian Islands back in the day. Well, what if it's not so deep? And therefore, it's much more stable. So you could really travel the Pacific in a way that you can't travel today because it's so deep and so formidable from when the weather hits, right? So these individuals either come from South America or they come from the Polynesian regions of the world or some mix thereof. They create the initial tribe that lives there and create these heads, which weren't initially as buried. They have to bury them a little bit, otherwise they're not going to stand up. And then later, they start creating the mixed race heads that match the people that discovered the place. Just as an honorarium to say, hey, you're bringing us stuff and, we dig you and we're peaceful people, right? But then this event occurs and you have a wave that wipes everybody out. It gets rediscovered. Maybe they inherited these rocks by the time the Dutch find it. Obviously, it's a teeny tiny island, easy to consume all the resources that might have been there. It doesn't actually look big enough to sustain any population whatsoever. But it looks like something very special had taken place there. The next one is the Derinkuyu, I'm probably saying that wrong, Turkish caves. And this is a network of caves that are absolutely gorgeous. I mean, they're very Yoda's house on Dagobah looking, very graduated curves, and it's beautiful and it's big. And a lot of people could live in this region. What's amazing about these caves is that they are undeniably inhabited. When studying the caves, there's a lot of evidence where there's consistency of purpose. So you could have areas look like eating areas that are slightly bigger, areas where people would have had little apartments. But of course, it is just a cave, and you're going to organically build this. And the thing about building a cave, think about this. We know what the Model T looks like, right? And we know what a 1965 Turbo Cobra looks like, right? Or 66, right? And we know what a Formula One car looks like in 2024. There's evolution. But because the Model T is its own entity and the other cars are their own entities, you don't see the evolution until you put them side by side. But now imagine you're building a network of caves. Well, your first commitments to building the first rooms, that's one technology. And as you get better at doing it, you're going to dig deeper and you're going to start making it bigger, and you start taking more risks because you've had some cave-ins here and there. And you're simply going to figure out the technology. And it's going to take a very long time. And so generations will be contributing to this dig out process, studying from their elders and then taking artistic license on these things. These are utterly fascinating. Now, they debate, of course, the use of these caves, and I think that's pretty legit. What else could you possibly say? It's who lived there and when they lived there is the real mystery, and it's going to be exceptionally difficult to ever solve that. Because we have to concede that there's history we have to concede that there is more history that will never be discovered unless we're given some history book by, some great alien race going, hey, we saw the whole thing. Here's all the HD photographs of who lived there. We didn't start recording history in any fashionable way until probably your cuneiform mud tablets, which unfortunately could be easily, well, I shouldn't say easily, but once you create cuneiform writing, Europeans could write that stuff and put it somewhere, and it's mud, right? And so as long as you take the mud from the indigenous area and have a technique of weathering it, you could write anything about the Babylonian times. But when you get to the hieroglyphs of Egypt, you really start seeing what man was capable of. And when someone, like for instance, the tale of the prodigal son that's in the Bible that Jesus quotes is a hieroglyph. It was written in, several thousand years prior to Christ's existence. And he never said he wrote it. He just said, this is something you need to hear, right? So when you see that someone could create a romantic, metaphorical, powerful story dating back, who knows how far, you're thinking, wow, humans were very intellectually developed. And you don't get art without peace most of the time. You have to have a peaceful era in a society before someone doesn't think about being killed every single day and going out on guard duty. Instead, they're raised into a family that is thinking in a more artistic manner. So when you look at these caves, even the ones in China, think about the intellectual process and the decisions it took to take the risk to do it. And then anything that is beyond functionality in the design of these caves, anything you think is artistic, think about someone making the decision to make it artistic, to make sweeped curves instead of right angle degrees, because that the body were to lay up against a wall to keep warm or to keep cool, and it was a nice curve, well, that's going to be natural to the shape of the human body as opposed to the way we build homes today. You would never sleep in the corner of your house, would you? It's a sharp, angular, threatening shape for a human being. The next one is a funny one. It's called the Roman dodecahedron. And these are bizarrely spread throughout Europe. And they're made of, I believe, copper? A copper alloy. This thing is a dodecahedron shape. I'll show it to you in the image, but it looks like a D&D die, a Dungeons and Dragons die. I think it's a 10-sided, right? We use these two of these for percentage rolls in Dungeons and Dragons. But this thing is hollow. It actually looks like a little toy that I bought my kid that vibrated, and she'd teethe on that thing. But it's been hollowed out, and it's been given these little kind of round spheres on the corners of this thing. It's hard to describe with words. But apparently these things have been found all over Europe. And they came out of the Roman era. And they can't figure out exactly what the hell these things are and what their purpose is. Now, the interesting story about these things is the first one was found in 1739, and they found 130 of these things so far. One of them they found inside of a tomb. But it's every major country in Europe, including the Netherlands, and they simply cannot figure out what the hell these boxes are for. Now, I guess one of them was like 1,000 grams, so they actually have magnitudinal differences, so they build them at different sizes. And I will just give you a funny analogy. This is not history with this device, but I want you to consider this as we're trying to figure out what this is. It's very decorative. It's very beautiful. The way, and especially, the craftsmanship, it looks pretty phenomenal for the time frame because it wasn't made in 1739. These things were found, and they think they went back. Well, they go back so far, there's no written history about what the hell this thing is. So none of them survived in modern history where someone's still using it to peel apples, right? Well, I had a funny story once told to me. I was helping a very eccentric man who was worth a tremendous amount of money. He mentored me for a year about all this deep state stuff because he had bounced in and out of it, and he hated it after he was in and out of it. The guy was probably in his 60s. I don't even know if he's still alive. It was 20 years ago. In fact, it's 21 years ago. And we started talking every day. He told me that he sold a lot of Native American jewelry and stuff, and he had spent a lot of time in the reservations talking to the Native Americans, of which most white men are not invited into these territories. And I also wrote a film that had a massive Native American element, and I had an employee of mine who went to Stanford on a Native American scholarship, 100% Native American. And they all three said the same thing. My research and these two individuals, none of which obviously know each other. And they said that they invented a lot of things to sell to the white men. And when they found out the white man would pay money to hear stories about Native American lore, they would just make up stuff. And one of the big ones is the dream catcher. Apparently this, in certain tribes, is well known as the biggest joke, biggest hoax ever played on white men. That it is something, but whatever it truly is not to catch your dreams. You don't put it on your wall to catch dreams and give it to you. I don't know what its real purpose is, and neither did my buddy who finally told me this. So I never had the dream catcher conversation with either my history or my historical research out of Stanford University or the buddy of mine that worked for me for 3 years. But this guy said, oh, yeah, it's hocus pocus. Now, so give that some credibility just for a second. Doesn't matter if that's true or not. I think it is, but fast forward 500 years. And there's all these dream catchers all over the United States, but let's just say Agenda 21 gets its way and everyone's wiped out. History is erased. Go see my review on the movie Rollerball. You'd find these things all over the place, but you wouldn't know what they do, right? But it was a decorative thing that simply made people happy, right? So maybe these Roman dodecahedrons are simply that. It's some mechanism. It could be like the bracelets that we wear to balance our energy, whether they work or not. Doesn't matter. I've got friends of mine who wear those things and never get sick. It's amazing. It could have been the belief that that's what it was. There's a cavity in the center, but there's a hole on all sides of this thing, so you can't imagine actually storing anything in it because it would fall out. In terms of it being some sort of toy, not sure. If it is a toy, then whatever makes it a toy is missing from the object, most likely. It could be something that's considered to be a spiritual thing, like we put crystals in our houses now because we know it absorbs EMF waves from cellular towers and wireless routers and then remodulates it to a much more healing frequency depending on what crystal you put in your house, right? So it's something that I think is fascinating. I don't think anyone's lying about it. I think if it produced energy or something, there might be a lot more than 130 of them. Who knows? I want to check it out. But the next one on the list is Coral Castle. And those of you who are diehards of the show, we've got an episode on Coral Castle, which I think is fairly exceptional, and there's many revisions and updates to Coral Castle. If you haven't heard about Coral Castle, it's about this gentleman who built a castle made of what they say is coral. It's sea coral, taken off the coast of Florida, and he would buy these. Now, technically speaking, it's actually limestone, but because of where it comes from, they call it Coral Castle. It's very pitted initially. But they were doing some construction and moving this stuff out, and he was buying the rocks. Well, these rocks were up to 60 tons a pop, 10 to 60 tons. The man who built it, his name was Edward, and his last name is actually Sacsayhuaman or something like that. Tiny guy. But every time they delivered the rocks on a flatbed truck, he said, okay, go around the corner. I'm going to get the rocks off your truck. Then you can go. And he'd take these rocks off the truck by himself. Now, there was a little rumor that 2 to 3 children rode around a bike once because he only worked at night because he said the sun messed up his technology. He wouldn't fight the photons of the sun. And we cover all this in the episode very scientifically. That they saw him holding 2 what looked like ice cream cones, or the sugar cone shape, and he was pulling these things off of the back of the flatbed truck with wires coming out of these things. Now, these cone-shaped things, I believe they've been removed from the most recent photographs of this place, but they did have them in the original photographs. You can find them online. They're in my episode, I'm sure. But this guy never bought power from the power company the entire time he exists. And after he built the whole thing, which is not like Disneyland or anything, but for a 110-pound guy, it is phenomenal what he built. And there's all kinds of mathematical embedded clues in this thing that will keep you busy for years. I probably spent 10 years of my life researching this off and on. But inside a little shed, he had this crazy wheel made of concrete and magnets with this rotary thing in the center. Now, for a long time, I couldn't figure out how the hell this thing worked, but the magnets are actually flipped, so the polarization fights each other. So he's creating an ethereal wind around this wheel, and the more you move it, the more you're going to interact with the more inert ether that's moving through the atmosphere at 50 times the speed of light. So he's creating this algorithm when he's moving this thing. But we could never figure out how that worked until I found a video of a guy who built one in his garage. He's this eclectic genius. What this guy figured out was ingenious. He saw it, right? When he looked at the photographs of Coral Castle, he figured out what was missing. In the photographs, you'll see that this wheel is on a table. And on the side of the table are these 2 weird protrusions from the table with nothing on them. It's kind of a round rectangle piece of steel on both sides of the table. Well, he looked at that and went, well, hell, there's the capacitor right there. So what he did was he built this wheel, identical in his garage. And then he took hundreds of feet of copper wire and wound 2 gigantic capacitors like you would find on an old television when you took the back off and you saw the cathode ray tube system on the back. There's a big coil of copper, which if you touched it, you would die unless you grounded the unit out. So he realized that when you take the magnets and you rotate the wheel, these big copper capacitors just amassed all this electricity. And then he could use it to light up his whole place. He could use it to create a sacred geometry algorithm, which may only work on limestone, and resonate the rock to be permeable to the ethereal pressures of the universe. Therefore, instead of ether pushing on the rock and giving it weight, it would actually seep through the rock, making it levitate, and he could take it off the back of the truck and drop it down. The guys leave. He uses the same technology to take it around the corner. Now, the daytime shots of him building Coral Castle show, I think, 10 by 10 tripods with pulleys and stuff. But if you pay really close attention, there's an electrical box on the top with 2 wires that go down to some mysterious connection point on the rocks. He has an assistant that helps him. Well, the assistant was noted as saying he would go and do the wheel thing, and then suddenly we would move the rock. So he does use pulley systems to put it in place with help, but getting the rocks on and off these vehicles by himself was something that's indisputable. And if you don't believe that, You got to study the fact that after he built it and realized that this girl he's trying to impress, I believe in New York, somewhere in New England, wasn't going to marry him, didn't want to live in his castle, even though he built a room for her mother. He didn't like where it was. He picked the whole thing up and moved it several miles south to a better location. Wow. And that's where you can go see it today. There is oh my gosh, I think it was 2013, I watched this 15-hour research into that wheel. And then looking at all of the geometry and clues he left behind and a lot of the structures that he built. And you start realizing there was a prime number connection to the wheel. I don't think you really need to get into that. When they asked Edward, how did you do this? He says, I figured out how they built the pyramids, and that's how I built this place. Okay. The other thing is that he wrote a paper on magnetism. And then one of the first paragraphs was, he said, everything you've ever been told about an atom is a lie. He said, at the center of an atom is a photon, nothing else. What's interesting about that is obviously chemistry works, right? Chemistry is tracking all of the components of an atom, the periodic table, and through various physics, you can, melt and connect things together and get them to, melt together and create all these alloys and stuff. So that science still works, but maybe the explanation of what you're actually doing, it might be a little bit different. But what this guy was doing, if you read the paper all the way through, and then you overlay on top of it the ethereal theories that Tesla and Faraday used to create all the electronic components that make our life possible today, you'll soon discover he's talking about ether the entire time he's having this conversation with you through this paper. Think about it. Would you want to read a paper by a guy like Neil deGrasse Tyson who hasn't been in a college for 50 years? Or would you rather read a paper from a guy who built an entire castle seemingly by himself in terms of lifting 60-ton rocks? He's got a gigantic door that's on a pivot that you just touch it with one finger. I don't know how heavy this door is, but it is at least 10 tons. Unbelievable. How do you do this kind of stuff, without knowing what you're talking about? So study from the masters, not from the guys who get paid to be on sitcoms. The next one I'm going to cover a little quicker, which is the Great Pyramids of Giza. Now, I have a episode. I believe the episode is called Scalar Pulses. I break down the Wardenclyffe Tower and how I think it actually works. And this was triggered by a Tesla Society that contacted me to decipher his death ray. They gave me, I think it's about 15 scan pages of Tesla's handwriting to figure out the mathematical equation of it's essentially a Wardenclyffe Tower that has been upgraded to a directed energy weapon, basically to atomize various elements in the universe like steel, iron, aluminum, that kind of stuff. This is a very above board thing that when you read his 1919 autobiography, he hints at what he was doing. And then you read his research that he was trying to sell this piece of equipment to every country that was about to enter World War II because he was trying to stop the suffering. Nobody bought it, of course, because that was a business that needed to happen and an agenda that needed to occur. But the Pyramids of Giza on this show borrows from a lot of research that's been done by, master electrical engineers that studied Giza, that studied the pyramids and said, wow, I figured out something. The inner limestone is a very conductive limestone. The outer limestone is a non-conductive limestone. And the corridors inside the pyramids are made of a particular type of granite, red granite, that is known to geologists and anyone studying the flow of electricity in the mantle as liquid rock. And when they asked the guy, what do you think these things are? He said, well, I wouldn't want to be in it when it's turned on. Now, most of you know that all the valence rocks have been pulled off of the pyramids. And I think that is to disable what it is. Because if you put all those non-conductive rocks back on top, the thing starts conducting electricity intensely. One of the archaeologists that was on top of the Great Pyramid in, I think, 1920s was eating lunch with a lot of his assistants. And he started noticing that the silverware was sparking really bad. So he immediately makes a Baghdad battery and takes a wine bottle, puts a piece of linen cloth on it, puts a fork in it. I believe it was a fork. And he stands up and lifts it over his head. And instantaneously, a lightning bolt was big enough to strike off that bottle and hit one of the guys. They immediately attack the guy because they think he's doing some witchcraft. But he figured out what this thing was. It conducts electricity. All the hieroglyphs that shows these, gigantic guys holding bulbs with filaments inside shaped like a serpent, which was their game, right? Serpent on the front of the head, right? Looks like they had light bulbs, right? So the Wardenclyffe Tower and the pyramids of Giza are absolutely related. So go look up my episode on scalar pulses. I know it's a weird title, but you'll be taken through with 3D images I created of Giza and the Wardenclyffe Tower to show you how the Wardenclyffe Tower works. And then when you want to create a directed energy weapon, what you have to understand is that and I've recently covered this, so I apologize if this is a bit of a repeat. When you create a Wardenclyffe Tower, and then it's an algorithm of how big it is, how much natural energy you've got out of the crust of the earth, and how much you capacitate up, that's how much it's going to create. If you built a really tiny one, it creates a little bit, just like Tesla coils you can buy online. You buy a tiny one, they call it the hairs. The hairs will go, you read it online, it'll say 12-inch hairs. Well, if you bought a really giant one, you'd have 6-foot hairs. You better be away from that thing when it's turned on. Well, the death ray was a much skinnier version of that went way up into the air and put a little the scalar pulse ball on top. And what he was going to do was modulate incoming metals from planes and ships and basically knock them out of the sky or sink them by simply knocking out perhaps just the bolts or basically atomizing the hulls of ships, or just enough to make it pointless. Bullets might explode because he hits copper or he hits whatever's indigenous to the weapons and melt them out of existence. This is official, real deal stuff that he was involved in. So a lot of the equations I found in the paperwork were related specifically to the dimensions of the tower itself. And of course, just like Pleasant Valley or Peaceful Valley inside of the Twilight Zone, he didn't want everyone to have this stuff because, they could do nasty things with it. Now the next one is called the Sumerian King's List. These are cuneiform tablets that talk about thousands of years ago, talking about the list of kings that presided over the world. What's fascinating about this is if you marry this, and if you look this up, it's just going to be cuneiform tablets, and then it's going to tell you history of this thing. Of course, cuneiform tablets, they started around 5,000, I think, BC. So 7,000 years ago and change, right? It starts, if you meld this with a lot of the research that Graham Hancock has done with the Egyptian Egyptian pharaohs, he has found temples that he has videotaped. I think he showed it on Joe Rogan's show and a bunch of other talk shows, or internet talk shows. And he shows you the indications of year and month over these columns, which are almost like square cartouches. Cartouches are usually round rectangles with a slash on the back because you read into the slash on the back. That's the direction you're reading. And it usually has the name of a pharaoh. So he found vertical versions of this inside of a temple. And according to his research, and he videotaped a bunch of these things, he goes, look, if you connect all these years together, you're going back 10,000 years of pharaohs, which absolutely destroys the revised history of Egypt. And again, Egypt, you've got a group of people that most likely inherited the land, crossbred with whoever was there. But again, you go back to King Tut's time, even before that, and look at the coloring, a lot of the more illustrated, not tombs, but a lot of the illustrated kind of catacombs underneath pyramids. You have a very dark-skinned race that is not the native, what we know now is the Arab race there. No doubt the Arabs have been taking care of the land forever, but there's a reason why they won't dig the place up. Again, we confidently believe with Brian Forster's research that he went down 1,500 feet and they said that he was only, I think, 4 stories down. And when they got down to this, he videotaped the whole thing. There's a foot and a half of water down there with a basalt, a black basalt floor, which is polished volcanic rock, which is what these big giant basalt boxes, and the basalt, there's black boxes and there's black tomb boxes, and it's crazy. No writing on them except a bunch of recent stuff that's been etched on by primitives that just can't remotely emulate what their elders did, right? But this begs, and they said there's 25 floors below this. He's at 4 floors, and he's way down. He's trying to estimate how far down they went, right? Because look, if what they're saying is correct, that means the Egyptians are nearly a mile under the ground. They just kept digging these chambers and chambers down. So there's a lot of history in the region of Giza and Cairo that it simply won't be dug out, because I think they know that it's going to reveal, one, the electrical capabilities of the area, and all the masons of Egypt know, if they're 60 and above, they know that this was down there and that this was all electrical down there. And again, it's all in that episode, Scalar Pulses. Maybe scalar pulse technology, just look up scalar. But why would that be covered up? Well, it will revise all of the history of Egypt, and it will hand over the actual brilliance of creating these pyramids and creating all this technology away from the indigenous race that doesn't seem to have any of that technology. And again, it's one of the commenters said it many years ago. He said, yeah, they went from pyramids to mud shacks. Right. Basically saying, you can't connect the current society with the previous society, because look what the previous society did. And I have to agree 1,000%. You had pi figured out. Everything the Greeks said they invented was already thousands of years in swing, potentially tens of thousands of years in swing in that region of Egypt. The next one's kind of funny. It's called the bloop sound. In 1997, a bunch of marine ships, submarines, and a bunch of other listening buoys and stuff heard this really weird, super loud noise, which they call bloop. And they never could figure out exactly, they couldn't really figure out exactly what the sound was. But it was this very clean, almost algorithmic sound, bloop. But it also had a shock to it and a concussion to it that was like, wow, that was really loud on the bottom of the ocean, or somewhere in there. They think they've got the GPS down on this thing. And they believe it to be, well, the official story is that it was icebergs way down at the bottom of the ocean popping. But if you look at icebergs in either the North Pole or South Pole, they don't go down that far. I mean, they go down a little ways, but not sure. Why would it only happen in 97 and not happen again? Could be a military exercise, that a bomb goes off way deep and they just want to see what's going on as they perfect the technology they might use in 2004 to create an earthquake in Indonesia and later off the coast of Fukushima. Probably the most romantic concept would be somehow the underwater UFOs that Bill Cooper said he officially saw off the bow of a ship when he was on guard duty, I think in 67, which got him into the Project Blue Book kind of projects. What if they're doing something down there and then boom, something happens that needs to occur? I doubt they would make a mistake, quite frankly. So it sounds to me like either something very natural or something military based. Either way, don't know how much it affects our life at this point, and I doubt anyone's spinning that because I didn't even know it ever happened, okay? Now the last one I've got, a lot of you have definitely seen this. I'm going to try to say this. Gobekli Tepe, right? It's a location in Turkey that they're excavating right now. If you like the pyramids of Giza and that blows your mind, which it does me for sure, this is probably your next sort of wonder of the world that definitely was not known at the time that they were characterizing wonders of the world. But this is being dug out of the ground. There's, I think, areas where it's under a canopy at this point to protect it, which is fantastic. But there's other areas that are exposed, and you have essentially a civilization that created almost like Stanley Kubrick monolith precision rocks that come up from the ground. And the precision of some of the areas are breathtaking. I mean, you're just like, holy crap. And they haven't dug the whole place out yet either. And then again, you have that evolution, like I talked about with caves in general, where they're digging out and they had lower technology in some areas, and then they finally started knocking it out, right, at supernatural levels of precision. And again, let's not forget, there are half a dozen boxes in Egypt. One of the most impressive boxes is underneath this pyramid that if you look on the outside, the pyramid looks pretty much destroyed. But they found the catacomb underneath, and you do this crazy walk down inside, and they've got this bathtub. I think it's a bathtub. It's slanted on purpose, but the precision on this bathtub is ridiculous. I mean, it's same with the basalt boxes. You can take a 90-degree square and put it in the corner, and it's perfect. How? I mean, how do they create and basalt rock is very, from what I understand, it's not that hard. It's not a level 9 rock or anything. So you bump it. You look at the sarcophagi basalt boxes they've got, and they've been knocked on the top by all these morons that found it, who used crowbars to open it up and destroyed it, which they denied that their people did. It's like, well, I can see it. I can see the destruction on the top of the box, and the lids are open because you wanted to find treasure. But meanwhile, you probably injured literally an alien artifact. I mean, this stuff is so insanely precision. If you could build that box, and there's no visible writing that looks like it's from the era. They did chisel on to some of this stuff. The worst impersonation of hieroglyphs you've ever seen in your life. I mean, just could make a straight line as they did this stuff. Meanwhile, the box itself is a testament to unbelievable engineering. But the writing is by like grandpa with Parkinson's. It makes no sense at all, right? So that stuff's been added at a later time to, again, injure history, to make sure you can't find who these people really were and what they were doing. The cool thing about Gobekli Tepe is that they do date it back to 9,000 BC to 8,000, 9,500 BC to 8,000 BC, which is interesting. What the archaeologists have said is that, of course, they're trying to say this is the first gatherer-hunter sort of civilization that it was ever found, that's been found to date, and that kind of thing. Which, okay, if you take the fact that they're trying to say that the Great Pyramids are as early as, say, 2,700 BC to 2,300 BC, this goes way back, and they're actually giving credit to that. What's cool about this last one is just that it's still evolving in front of our eyes, and it's been evolving sort of real time online. A lot of articles are being printed as they discover a new area of it. And it's the difference between having, the Egyptian discoveries, which really start getting a lot of heat on them around the mid to late 1800s, where a lot of great men went down there and figured out the phenomenal things about what the Egyptians were doing, including boring holes inside level 9 rock, and they think it happened within 60 seconds. So whatever machine they had went whoop right down inside and pulled these cylinders out. The other one is that we actually have proof that they had some sort of bandsaw technology, and not bandsaw, circular saw technology to cut these rocks in Egypt. And it's in all the rocks that are laying on the ground around the pyramids, around the temples, that were just sort of the fodder that's put off. But they have amazing rocks or structures that are just sitting on the sidelines, leaned over. But if you bring that to Missouri to some, rock cutting company, and you say, make this out of one piece of rock, they're going to say, I got some rock and you can pound it because I can't do this, okay? Or if you want to spend $10 million, I'll have a couple guys do it. It's not going to be quite as good as that, but it'll emulate this thing. They can't do it. I once had a picture of a box that actually had teeth. So the lid of the box had 4 teeth in it, pretty big nubs, and the teeth fell inside the lip of the box. Okay, but when they put the lid on, they realized that the granite texture actually continued from the lid into the body of the box. So this was all one piece of stone. Well, how do you cut the lid off? If you just cut the lid off of a box, you could understand maybe how that could work if you had a circular saw technology, right? But how do you keep the nubs on? How do you do nubs in 3D on this thing? It just doesn't make any sense how that's even possible to this day. You'd have to have some wild laser technology where it didn't burn the rock that it hit, but if two lasers collide inside the rock, you could boil that rock away. I mean, that's, I think there'd be artifacts to that effect. Not in these boxes. It's just like straight up alien technology, right? Which is where that gets attached. Aliens get attached to Giza, especially because so much technology has been lost. So many lies have been told around it that you're like, well, of course. And of course, we know that there's bizarre runways all over the world. Even I think Peru, next to the line drawings, there's some plateaus up there and nothing was built on them. Now, the funny thing about a runway being some sort of landing pad for an alien vehicle, it means that they're flying in biplanes where they need to do that. Makes no sense other than maybe lining up a bunch of them. But if you had a UFO, why do you need to land anywhere where it's flat? You can just drop your little legs out and boom, you're right there. Who cares, right? There's obviously hundreds of these things out there. I just picked 20 that I thought were pretty cool. And some of them I didn't know, which was appealing to me to learn some new stuff. I think that where you have the layers of lies that I think are hopefully going to be exposed here shortly, a big chunk of them. And remember, every truth that ever comes out about anything, especially a big truth, that is a thread in a giant sweater of lies. So it's important as human beings that if one appeals to you, if that's something that you already have a talent for, an eye for, an ear for, a logic gate in your brain for, you need to grab that thread and be the one that pulls it completely out and goes, hey, I've been an electrical engineer for 35 years. And man, when I heard about the pyramids being these different versions of limestone with the granite, I went and researched. I didn't even believe it, but I went and researched it. And oh my gosh, I learned that the plateaus are taller than the pyramid and that there's a catacomb of water in those things. And it's built on top of an aquifer such that natural electricity is coming out of the crust, charging this water. And the plateau has a bunch of holes in it where staffs of iron built out of meteorites were used to complete circuits, used to heal people in beds. Just saying, you might be the person to really go off and crack something open. We're going to be in potentially, next 4 years, in an era of reveal. And I can't tell you how important that is to jump on that bandwagon and help create your own Telegram channel, feed stuff into there. That's the chain of thinking you have. Create a YouTube channel. If you're not a face person, do Telegram. We have a Telegram channel that is more current events for sure. For those of you who miss my chaos reports on Rumble, I have a formula that might be able to rejuvenate those without the negativity. I'm still mulling that over. You have tools right now. Freedom of speech is vital for humanity. Freedom is something that every animal understands. Remember that. My analogy has always been take any animal or insect in the world. If you don't believe that freedom is something given to you by God himself, put any type of creature in a little plexiglass box and watch what happens. They're pissed. A spider's pissed. Everything is pissed because they want their freedom, because that's what they're programmed to have. And you are the most sophisticated creature that we know of on this plane of existence. So it's important to protect it. So I expect you to turn on those big brains of yours and get involved with something that turns you on. Grab a hold of some different subject matter and push that up. If you guys have suggestions for other technologies, hidden technologies especially, I'm trying to amass a really good list of 20 new things for part 2 of hidden technologies that we can discuss. So go watch that episode if you haven't. Take down the ones that we've already covered. Or if I missed something in one of the subjects that's important to you, let me know, and I'll go revisit that one for you. But definitely, this is our show. We're participating together. One of you gave me an idea for doing a space shuttle specific episode. I'm researching that one. It's a very sophisticated machine that we created, and it's important to take you through the history of how that thing was developed so you can have some instincts about perhaps what it was trying to really do. Anyway, if you haven't been to the website, please go. All the videos are on there that are still live. I don't know how many I've done at this point, but it's probably in 850 range. Probably a good 50 have been one-time shows that I pulled off, but most of it's up there. There's also the audio if you came in through video, like to listen to this in your car, or if you want to hear one again, you've already seen the pictures and you're like, I was kind of asleep when I was listening. You can get that there. There's also a store with some fun shirts with decent prices, and there's a way to contribute to the show, plus all of our social media links and all that good stuff. But to the Patreon, PayPal people, thank you so much and make it happen. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.